Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 9th of November in the 45th week of 2012. For more than 20 years, our program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that has been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then give the others a chance to comment on it. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20-some years that we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. This week, Barack Hussein Obama was elected to a second term as Chief Magistrate of the United States of America. That, by the way, was the term preferred by the framers of the 1787 Constitution after they decided not to place the executive functions into a presidential committee rather than an individual. That was the leading plan, but then they decided no, it probably would be better to have a chief secretary, a chief magistrate, rather than a executive committee. So, Obama has a second term, or as they say in his administration, a double tap. The U.S. government has long maintained, remarkably enough, that a defining tactic of terrorism is to launch a follow-up attack aimed at those who go to the scene of the original attack to rescue the wounded and remove the dead. Morally, such methods have also been widely condemned as a mark of particular savagery. Yet, as has been demonstrated recently, this is the tactic followed by Obama's drone strikes. That the decision to strike with a drone is followed up with another shortly thereafter to hit the rescuers, a double tap in the language of barbaric Washington these days. Election Day last week, or this week, was also Terror Tuesday for the Obama administration, the day that Obama adds names to the kill list for the drone strikes. And not even a full day had passed from his re-election when President Obama ordered another drone strike in Yemen. Most of us have to go to the map to find out where Yemen is, but most of us know that we're not at war with Yemen. Nevertheless, our re-elected president thinks he has the right to kill people at will in Yemen, and he does it in a particularly inefficient fashion, in that the people killed are not very carefully defined before Obama's killing drones are set to work. The day within 24 hours of his re-election, a U.S. drone strike targeted what was called a group of al-Qaeda militants. We found recently that al-Qaeda militants are young men of military age who are killed by a drone. He targeted a group of al-Qaeda militants on the outskirts of the Yemeni capital of Sana'a on Wednesday night, killing at least 3 terrorists, the government said. A White House spokesman did not comment on the report from Yemen that there had been this attack. It pointed out that if there were an American strike, it would, of course, have been authorized by the re-elected president. Drone strikes, drone war in general, violates both domestic international law and the Obama administration's vehement disdain for transparency in government is the only thing keeping it from public and legal scrutiny. In addition to the question of whether it violates the law, which it obviously does, it's also obviously an example of the spirit of the age. It's terrorism. I came across a comment from the novelist Ernest Hemingway from an article he wrote between the First and Second World War. It appeared in an American magazine in 1935, and the following line was included, quote, "We in America should see that no man is ever given, no matter how gradually or how noble and excellent the man, the power to put this country into a war which is now being prepared and brought closer each day with all the premeditation of a long-planned murder. For when you give power to an executive, you do not know who will be filling that position when the time of crisis comes." Now, that makes some sense in the 1930s, but in a larger sense, the premeditation of long-planned murder has been taken on by our new president for some time, and we all knew that when he was reelected. This is something that at some point, I think, we'll have to pay for. So this is News from Neptune, the Obama's Double Tap edition, and Ron Szoke has the first tap tonight.
Yes, well, I assumed, or rather just acquiesced in the notion that we'd be talking about the election to some extent and what it all meant, and
Tell us, Ron.
Yeah, right.
Mr. Natural.
That's the pundit's game, of course, to tell you what it all means. And
that's what we're here for.
Yeah, I don't like to indulge in that, but I feel driven to it somehow, sometimes. But anyway, one of the things revealed apparently was that it's not always possible for the oligarchs, the big rich, to buy elections. They sank millions upon millions into the Romney campaign in particular, financing attack ads on Obama. And here's an account in New York Times, November 7th, little to show for cash flood by big donors. The setting here is the private air terminal at Logan Airport in Boston. All of the Gulfstream private jets, corporate jets, came apparently bringing people who came there for the victory celebration. The word seems to be that Mr. Romney's campaign did not prepare any kind of loss statement. There was no one in the Romney campaign who will admit to having any plans for what would happen if they lost. It was just inconceivable to them that they would lose. So they spent that night and the next morning at a breakfast there, commiserating with each other, explaining what happened. The most expensive election in American history drew to a close this week with a price tag estimated at more than $6 billion, propelled by legal and regulatory decisions that allowed wealthy donors to pour record amounts of cash into races around the country. So it says, while outside spending affected the election in innumerable ways, reshaping the Republican presidential nominating contest and so on, it was ultimately largely unavailing. The election's most lavishly self-financed candidate fared no better. Linda McMahon, a Connecticut Republican who's a former wrestling executive, spent close to $100 million, nearly all of it her own money, on 2 races for the Senate, conceding defeat on Tuesday for the second time in 3 years. So big bucks don't always prevail, but of course the candidates would always prefer to have $2 rather than 1, or 20 million rather than 10, and so on. And they presumably have some basis for that, some rationale.
You want to comment on that, David, before I start tearing my hair out about it?
Well, the question about whether the money was well spent or badly spent, I mean, the question is whether the interests of the people who spend all that money will ultimately be served. And I think there's a good case to be made that they will be. Yeah. The political spectrum has moved far to the right. Romney runs as a far-right candidate who, towards the end of the campaign, attempts to convince people that he's a moderate after all. Obama runs as a kind of center-right candidate. There's no really center or center-left, as Thomas Friedman likes to say or think. So the question is, all this money will continue to move if you want to think about this in terms of a political spectrum, because it really isn't much of a spectrum, it's mainly the interest of the 1% and how that will play itself out in this sort of fixed configuration of the Electoral College, blue states and red states, and appeals to various groups, never along the lines of social class. So I don't think that the people who would like to think that money failed should get too complacent about what the practical result of this is going to all be.
Yeah. Well, in the Wisconsin recall election, for example, the recallers were outspent 7 or 8 to 1 by the anti-recall people. A lot of money was poured into that. Carl's theory was that the money had nothing to do with the result, right? It was a matter of the good sense of the people of Wisconsin seeing right through the liberal rhetoric. Isn't that right, Carl?
Well, it's not. That's a slightly tendentious presentation of my view, but I've come to expect nothing less, Ron. So, certainly money has an effect. The notion that elections can be bought or sold simply, I think, is false. It's a much more complex business.
Yeah.
It's certainly false to say that, as I quote, it's not possible for the big rich to buy an election, close quote. Certainly it is. It takes some effort. They have to work on it a lot. And it helps very much that what actually happens is that a sham contest is carried out where whatever the outcome is, the big rich are perfectly happy. The notion that the best way to control a political situation is to establish narrow limits within which two apparently differing competitors fight it out. But the questions, the assumptions of the system are never challenged. Now look, going into this election, the 1% had their candidate, Barack Obama, whom they had backed to the hilt against a supposedly conservative candidate in 2008. Wall Street spent far more money on the Obama campaign in 2008 than they did on the McCain campaign. They had their man in office. The job was taken care of. The things they were most concerned about, from austerity to taxes to the war, were all in place. Things were tripping over gracefully down the primrose path, and they didn't have any problem. Now comes another candidate, a candidate whose candidacy is largely a joke, but still in all, if he were to become president, he might even be better for the big rich than the big rich man who is the big richest man who is in place. Oh, fine, send him some money. It's no skin off their nose, and the bet might come in. The idea that we had some sort of contest in this election between the candidate of the rich and the candidate of, quote, the people, close quote, is absolute nonsense, however much it was supported by the Obama campaign. Come on.
Yeah.
Big rich bought the election.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me is the power of big money to ultimately have its way, even if they've it looks as if they've been defeated in the election. Again, the bias in that direction has not been stopped, I'm sure. What happens is this amazing power of big money to create certain presumptions, certain assumptions about what the game is and how it's to be played, and so on. Another indication of this is the press freedom. Here's an article going back several months, actually. After the arrest of the journalists that were covering the Occupy demonstrations, the the United States plummets, this says, in global press freedom rankings down to number 47. And another indication of this, which I thought was amusing, in Greece, the day after a journalist published a list of the 2,000 people who had presumably secret Swiss bank accounts. He had obtained this list somewhere and published it. He was promptly arrested. And then he was put on trial within a day or two, and then as quickly acquitted. And because this was so scandalous, I mean, it's so obvious that he had done something that the big rich, the 2,000 suspected tax evaders, didn't like, and their message got through to the civil authorities. So it shows you what can happen, although there was ultimate vindication that if you say something that those people dislike, you may be in danger.
It
Well,
may be, yeah.
What happened on November 6th was, I think, to some extent foreshadowed by consumer confidence figures that I've seen that arose to the highest figures since 2008. Confidence among American consumers climbed in October to a more than 4-year high, which may help drive bigger gains in the largest part of the economy. So that's always consumer spending, about 70% of the economy. The lower unemployment rate and firming housing prices have made consumers feel a little bit more confident, said Richard Moody, chief economist at Regions Financial Corporation in Birmingham, Alabama. So there was a slight uptick in the some of the indexes of consumer confidence and spending, but the big worry of the people that we're talking about among the 1%, and its media helpers, is the what's called investor confidence. And investor confidence is apparently taking a nosedive because of Greece and Spain and so on, and attempts to impose austerity and restore investor confidence in the bonds of those countries is what's causing a lot of agitation, rioting, bonfires and barricades in the streets in Athens and Madrid and so on.
Isn't this the confidence fairy that Paul Krugman makes such fun of?
Yeah, she sprinkles her fairy dust over everything.
But I think relying on the confidence fairy and the investor confidence as an explanation of what's going on in Europe and Greece would in Europe in general, and therefore in Greece, would be a big mistake. I mean, the problem in Greece and so forth is not to restore investors' confidence. The problem is to pay the banks. The banks are insisting that they be paid, and they don't care whether the Greek economy goes to hell or not. And even to put a finer point on it, they don't care about the actual lives of Greek citizens who are unable to get the necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter, because the banks have to be paid first. Now, that's an unstable situation, and it's unstable because it's not at all clear that people will put up with that finally, and that they will, definitely pay the banks. The banks are working very hard, all sorts of ways, to make sure that they get paid. But there are far fewer bankers than there are Greek citizens, and sooner or later, something's got to give. Yeah. Now, we had a similar situation in Europe in the 1930s, and what gave there was the establishment of authoritarian regimes that could make the trains run on time. And that's a very real possibility, it seems to me, in Europe right now, and not an impossible possibility in America.
Yeah, some have pointed to that tendency in the psychodynamics of what led up to Germany in the 30s and World War II, is that a frightened and decimated middle class will increasingly turn to some authoritarian leader, a man on horseback, who they think will be their savior and
well, let's
solve the
pursue that
problem.
for a minute, Ron. It's not because they're stupid or even because they're evil. We forget that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which came to power in Germany in 1933, actually did make the trains run on time in the sense of providing for the general welfare. And that the fact that they were a group of criminals who eventually launched a war that involved all of Europe is the great tragedy of the situation. But they would not have got there in the first place if they weren't dealing with real problems that the German people had. Now, on the old line that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, they were able to convince enough people that the source of the German people's problems were the Jews, not the capitalists. And
well, that's a relatively late thought, actually.
Yes.
Kind of an afterthought.
Exactly.
Their original attacks, their original appeal was always against the socialists and the communists.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's quite right.
Yeah.
And that's to be remembered.
Yeah.
But look, I mean, the leading economies of the 1930s, the largest economies of the 1930s, Germany, the United States, and the Soviet Union, all essentially dealt with the Depression in the same way. They put their trust in a leader, a father figure. They established a command economy that did indeed provide for some relief for the people who were hurting, and went on from there with the leader in charge. Whether it was Roosevelt or Hitler or Stalin, the mechanism was in outline the same. And I think we ignore that at our peril because it may be happening again, eh?
Yeah.
Two comments. One rather sarcastic, at least, in saying that at least if this happens again in Europe, anti-Semitism will probably not be the socialism of fools, because Israel will be in full support of these right-wing regimes as long as they adhere to the international economic consensus, and in fact they will probably be there selling them military arms and sending advisors in and so on and so forth, as Israel so often does. So I think, in spite of efforts whenever any kind of attack on Jews happens in Europe, to say for very cynical reasons for Israeli leaders or Jewish leaders in this country to talk about the persistence of anti-Semitism in Europe, we probably won't be saying that. That was my first point. Now I've forgotten what my second point is.
It'll come back. They tend to.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It may have to choose some different Semites.
Oh,
this
well,
time,
let me say this. Well, no, here's my second point, and that is that why if Germany was, you had this fascism and in Italy and Germany, what was it about a solution to the economic problems to put people back to work that also compelled them to go to war? But that is not only a question of Nazi Germany. That is a question of, for instance, the United States after
Exactly.
World War II. We kept going to war, and we've kept going to war ever since, for, people might think a strange thing to say, in a sense, for some of the same reasons that Nazi Germany had to invade Poland in 1939, had to invade the rest of Europe, had to invade Russia in 1941.
That's a crucial point, David, and one that's difficult for us to admit, again, with the American mythology, what it is. It also applies to the United States and its contest with Japan before the Second World War. Most Americans believe the Second World War in the Pacific began suddenly, to everyone's surprise, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Well, in fact, the United States and Japan had been in conflict for more than a generation before that, and what you say about these authoritarian governments of the 30s applied also to Roosevelt's government, and the usefulness of the confrontation with Japan for the construction of the society that the New Deal was working on. In fact, it's obvious to us now, generations later, that the solution to the Depression in America, where the steps taken by the Roosevelt administration were never quite so vigorous as the steps taken in Germany and Russia, in America it was the war which ended the Depression. War production produced employment, and that was the way out of the Depression, not the New Deal. The New Deal certainly did some good things, many of them important palliatives, necessary palliatives, but it was the war that ended the Depression. No question.
Yeah, some observers have said that it was clear that the USA and Japan were on a collision course for at least a decade before Pearl Harbor.
And that collision had to do with American imperialism in the Pacific,
Yes.
and specifically
Yes.
the conflict over China.
Yes.
Who was going to rule in China? That was what the Japanese Empire and the American Empire were fighting over, and were long before Pearl Harbor, and the matter was torn when the Japanese moved into Southeast Asia, where the U.S. was concerned that the resources that the American Empire was trying to deny Japan would now be available to the Japanese Empire. Then the war was inevitable.
We see another conflict building now as those in the Middle East supposedly are decreasing. We're building up another conflict in the Western Pacific with China,
Yep.
and some are saying that another collision is inevitable there too, within 10, 20 years, whatever you might guess, but it has to come. Who's going to be the big dog in that area?
Well, and one has to wonder, in the way that David raised the question, about any country that decides it has to substitute military force, preparedness and security are the words we use, military force for economic competition with another state. In a sense, that's what the Germans did in the 30s. That's what the Americans seem to be doing now vis-a-vis China, and the possibility that will end in tears is very great.
Yeah.
You're listening to News from Neptune. I think we'll go to David Green for maybe a new topic.
Yes, a new topic. I was going to begin, as I was thinking about what to do this week during election week, I was going to try to bring in some perspectives, just get a few things off my chest about the rhetoric leading up to this election, especially in regard to red states and blue states and the alleged evil of the red states versus the goodness of the blue states, in terms of how that distracts us from issues of social class in this country, I think, and how political parties have evolved in this country in order to distract us from issues of social class. I think that's a great topic and something we should return to either on this show or in coming weeks. But I've got a topic on the burner here that has substituted and overwhelmed my desire to continue to talk about red states and blue states, and that was precipitated by a visit last evening at Follinger Auditorium on campus by a man named David Harvey, who has been, I'm sure, spoken of before on this show, who actually teaches in a department of anthropology, but is usually referred to as a geographer or a Marxist geographer. He's really a sort of combination economist, geographer, and in some ways cultural critic. And I think that the perspectives that he brings to the fields in which the important issues that he researches and thinks about are important. There also happens to be an article, or I guess an interview actually, on the ZNet website this morning pertaining to his book Rebel Cities, which was the topic of his talk last night, which was encouragingly well attended at Follinger by, I assume, 300 or 400 or 500 people. It's hard to count sometimes, especially when you don't even try. But but still, and let me summarize what I think David Harvey brings to this and why I feel like it's so important for you listeners and for us to read his work and take his work seriously. The first thing you can do is go online. I know we've shown before on this program a sort of animated 12-minute overview of his perspectives on the crises in capitalism. He takes things from a very Marxist perspective, from a historical perspective, but not only that, from an urban perspective, in which he's talking about how all these crises play themselves out, not only in macroeconomic context, but in sort of spatial context. And to play off what Ron concluded his remarks in terms of was a global context, how really a deeper understanding of how these money flows and economic flows and productivity flows and import-export flows relate the global economy, relate to the rise and fall of empires, including our own, and what would seem to be the inevitable rise of China, the dominance of China, which will certainly there will be attempts to stop this, and blood will probably be shed in this, but it will probably not be stopped if history is any precedent to what will happen over the next 20 or 50 or 100 years. The context in which Harvey talks are so important and so complex that it's hard to summarize them. But part of it has to do, his emphasis on urbanism, part of it relates directly to the housing market and how the housing market has evolved in this country since World War II. The move towards encouraging people to own homes, but that process, which was a way of gaining returns on capital, wasn't, and which the suburbanization that went on with that, and the whole suburban phenomenon, and the consumer phenomenon, which began to fall apart as early as the 1970s in the neoliberal era, and really came apart in the last 10 years as the securitization of those mortgages became a financial tool, which was part of which, along with the housing boom and bust and all of the other complex Wall Street shenanigans that went on with that, have gotten us to the state that we're in. These things can be understood, they should be understood in basic terms, and it's probably, I find it best to start in just trying to understand what some of these words mean and what was going on in companies like Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers and Salomon Brothers and Bear Stearns and all this. But to move beyond all these despicable characters, from Michael Milken to John Paulson, who were referred to a couple weeks ago, to an understanding of the crises in capitalism, the nature of capitalism and the crisis in capitalism that we are still left with and that needs to be resolved, and that Harvey, going beyond Keynesian thinkers, who we mention often favorably on this program and who I rely upon in important ways, Paul Krugman, Dean Baker, and so forth, I think Harvey's understanding gets into a deeper understanding of what really needs to be, what kind of movement really needs to come out of this, especially in the urban context. And we see that in a most poignant way, of course, in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in New York City, and it's the intersection between the environment, the crisis in capitalism, the crisis in finance, the economic inequality, which played out obviously in very devastating ways, in even too devastating ways as a result of that in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. So Harvey spoke last night for over an hour about this, answered questions for nearly another hour, was clearly tired, and didn't put his points across perhaps with some of the enthusiasm and pointedness that you might see if you go online and watch some of his videos or read some of his work. But he is a genuine academic and a genuine radical, and I hope this came across to the people who attended this last night.
It was important, and what I would love to do is make sure that in our discussion next week we go into some of the details of Harvey's book. It is very important and touches on a lot of the things we've mentioned already today. Ron, you have a take on this?
No, the only book of his I have is The Short History of Neoliberalism.
Which is essential,
one
of the most important political books written in the last decade.
Right. Right, and I find it resonates with me a great deal, but I guess I'm a little short on knowing what practical, immediate conclusions for action that I should draw from it.
Let's
But,
make that the agenda for next week.
Yeah.
Harvey, neoliberalism in cities, and the agenda for action, if you like. I can't think of anything better to do with it than
And
that.
he has a website, davidharvey.org, and if you go to the ZNet article, you can click on his name on what they call a Z-Space page, and read many sort of summary articles and interviews that will give you an idea. It's complex. It's an ambitious undertaking to try to understand the depth of what he's saying historically and economically and sort of spatially. And then I just would like to put in a plug for the person who brought him here, who I happen to know. His name is Colin Flint, and he's a professor in the geography department on campus here. There's there's something to be said about the fact that the economics department on our campus could not conceivably have brought in David Harvey to speak. So thankfully, some of these vanguard, for want of a better word, some of these forerunning ideas in understanding neoliberalism have to be found, unfortunately, for obvious reasons, in the academy outside of the established sort of social science disciplines as they currently function. A few token voices aside.
Yeah.
We'll try to post some of this material on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. I'm also want to post something about this notion of the fecklessness of the academy on important questions, economic and political. Came up again this last week when we were talking about the way in which during the Vietnam War, a number of American scholars in the university, mainly younger scholars, who often were academically at risk, did a good deal of important work on unmasking the government's propaganda about the Vietnam War. And it's really quite striking how the same thing hasn't happened over the last 10 years in regard to the Bush-Obama war war against the greater Middle East. I was led to reflect on that by an article by Jason Burke, who wrote one of the first best books on Al-Qaeda that appeared in The Guardian this weekend, listing a dozen titles by foreign academics, independent scholars, and journalists that make up for that vast silence of American academics about the war in the Middle East. I'll put that on the Facebook page for News from Neptune as well.
And therefore, we've had to rely on people like Bradley Manning, Julian Assange, and Glenn Greenwald to uncover a lot of this stuff. And people except for the internet and the growth of the internet, shouldn't have to serve as a substitute for academic research, especially given the protections generally given. You may want to argue about that with me, Carl, about the 1960s. I'm sure people were fired. Maybe you were one of them.
3 times, as a matter of fact. But
wow.
Thereby hangs a tale, as they say.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things to me is always the patterns of thought that emerge after some incident like this, and the Romney loss being an example of the recriminations that are occurring now among his campaign staff and the Republicans generally, and this utterly futile question of who do we blame? Whose fault was it? And that's interesting. There's in a way a reversion to the old stab in the back theory. We were defeated not because of anything that we did, but there were disloyal and treasonous elements. This goes all the way back to the German response to World War I and the U.S. after Vietnam. We were never defeated by the Viet Cong. It was the dissidents and the student radicals at home that really caused it, and this remarkable inability to engage in any problem solving aside from all the who do we blame, who are the bad people here who need to be punished.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, Ron, you should just read the comments of people like Bill O'Reilly.
Yes, that's a classic.
Absolute
classic.
And Coulter and Rush Limbaugh, who are just they're not talking about stab in the back. They're talking about the American people sort of stabbing themselves in the back. We just we're the 47%, or what turns out to be the 50.
They want to be given things.
We turned about to be the 51% according to the election returns. And so, therefore, we want stuff, and we are bringing down American civilization, and so at least
it's the profits of the 1%.
They really couldn't. Romney being, the relatively acceptable figure, and there being no one. It wasn't like McCain in 2008, where there was a lot of controversy with Sarah Palin and all this stuff. The Tea Party's sort of come and gone in a certain sense, so you have to blame the people now. We just don't get it.
I think it's a perfectly legitimate question. Who do we blame? Who do we blame for the fact that we've just gone through an absolute sham of an election that is the only real purpose that it served was a distraction for the American people, the notion that political decisions are being made that might actually help them, and so forth, in this sideshow, this con game that has been set up by the American ascendancy. Now, this is, who do we blame? I'd really like to know, and I think we would learn something if we could give an accurate answer to that question. You're watching News from Neptune. I've got a.
But it's not us, right?
Yeah.
Right.
It's not the three of us. So
I'm not even sure. There are things maybe we should have done.
Hey, classic phrase. Well, mistakes were made, but not by me.
Right. Well, worthwhile to think who might have made the mistake. It also might be worthwhile to think about what this election actually accomplished. Was it indeed a victory for progressives, as many self-styled liberals are saying? We have a communication from the mysterious Dr. No, the former producer of the radio version of this program, who sends the following comment. He said, "Did you see the Democracy Now! Show that recapped the election with Laura Flanders and Ben Jealous?" And the transcript and the video, as all Democracy Now! Shows, are online. Dr. No says they mentioned Senator-elect Warren, Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, but only in the big progressive advantage was supposedly Elizabeth Warren over Scott Brown for as they say, Ted Kennedy's seat. Look, I was living in Massachusetts when Ted Kennedy was elected to the seat. It was the most corrupt election one has heard of in some time. But once again, another story. The point about Democracy Now! Coverage of the Senate election in Massachusetts was they mentioned Senator-elect Warren, but only in the context of her being a woman and her work at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Shockingly, not one word about her views on foreign policy and the fact that she supports the Obama-Bush war against the greater Middle East. Dr. No continues, "It seems to me that despite her now being a U.S. Senator, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau can be marginalized, precisely as Amy Goodman put it, quote, because of the other senators' involvement with the banks across the board. Here's how Senator Warren's expected votes to sustain an increased war funding will cost America trillions, money that can trump whatever good she does for U.S. consumers with the bank. You'll save some money by her cleaning up some home loans, and lose way more money, and more importantly, lives, as Senator Warren votes to kill people at home and abroad." You can see the account of Warren's foreign policy views in an article on the Counterpunch website, and her issues, so to speak, to put it gently, with ostensible progressive values. We can't let Iran get nukes. We've got to support Obama's kill list. All these things. This was not part of the debate in Massachusetts, but they're positions that the new Senator Warren has embraced. On the Democracy Now! Account of this, the progressive in the show remained silent on the war issues. After all, she was the progressive candidate, which is particularly damning because Democracy Now! Pitches itself as the War and Peace Report. And Dr. No concludes, I expect Goodman and company to read up on these things and ask tough questions even of their friends. I posted a link to Democracy Now! Pointing them to the Boston newspaper article that exposed Warren's hawkish views. When that article came out, apparently nothing came of my effort, close quote, because it never mentioned on Democracy Now! Okay, so an ambiguous victory at best. We want to turn now to the newest feature on News from Neptune, Coburn's Corner. This is a consideration of language occasioned by the late Alex Coburn's last book, a pamphlet called Guillotine, in which he points out that, I quote, there are certain words which have counter-revolutionary potential in the sense they have the power to debase and coarsen common speech by repeated and thoughtless use. Those words shall be condemned. And Coburn sets out a long fantasy about words being taken to the guillotine in the context of a French Revolution against bad language. I quote the beginning of the pamphlet. It's early morning on a spring day in the month of Prairial, year of the Revolution II in Paris, but already the Tricoteuses are making sure that they have their seats in front of the guillotine at the Place de la Révolution. Rumor is running rife. Prosecutor Fouquier Tinville has agreed that there are certain words which have counter-revolutionary potential, in the sense they have the power, as Fouquier put it, to debase and coarsen common speech by repeated and thoughtless use. There's a grinding noise, a squeaking of axle, and round the corner from his long journey from the from the office, comes the first load of the condemned. And we are trying to fill the carts, not with perhaps its usual material, but with words. Ron, you got some today for
Yeah, well, last week I had
guillotine?
several suggestions for the extreme haircut. Favorite one being war on this and war on that. That has become so debased, people don't even think about war and what it implies anymore, I suppose.
Now, you mentioned that one last week.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I agree with you entirely. That's quite right.
How about not so much? Not so much this.
That's almost, I almost would reprieve, not so much. Mainly because I heard it first from my teenage daughter a number of years ago.
Yeah. Battleground state, swing state.
Yeah.
Like Ohio.
Into the cart.
We can get red and blue states, but we're stuck with that.
Pushback.
Ooh, yes, here.
Yeah. Iconic was actually mentioned in there.
Yes,
on page
Coburn
4.
mentions iconic towards the top of the beginning of his pamphlet.
Right, and what is that supposed to mean? Ironic, isn't it ironic? Pop irony.
There's a good one, and wrongly used. Irony actually has a traditional meaning, which is not what we mean when we say
how about,
it's ironic.
X is the new Y.
Okay,
70 is the new 40. Or,
I'll vote for condemnation of that.
Okay.
I don't know why.
Yeah, but
60
narrative.
is the new 40?
Yeah, narrative they mention. And these
I'm
other
sorry,
things,
say again?
Narrative.
Narrative, absolutely, yes.
That's one of Alex's favorites, along with meme.
Yeah, right. So there
a
are a
lot
bunch
of
of
these
things
have
like
their
that.
roots in the postmodernist Paul of recent academic, back to the, we're smiting academics today, and that's a good place to start.
So there are many comments on this in some older books about usage. Fowler in particular, who's really funny sometimes. He's so dogmatic about
I love Fowler.
Slogans, buzzwords, catchphrases, what he calls hackneyed phrases, battered ornaments, and irrelevant allusions, worn-out humor, and of course cliches, drawn primarily from the Bible and Shakespeare and so on. But
Someone has said that the mark of a good education is to be able to quote the Bible and not attribute it to Shakespeare.
Right. But
or the other way around, maybe.
Yeah, some I've already mentioned last week. Hard-earned money, capture the imagination, which really annoys me. But anyway. Deeper ones are cult and myth and the way they're commonly spoken of, and those terms are misused. But
to the tumbril.
Yeah.
David, you got some candidates?
Yeah.
Ron
I
has
wanted to
spread
say-
his net wide here.
Yeah, I just want to say, for the sake of modesty, which we probably have too little of on this program, that these are things that we're poking at ourselves. I mean, I
Yes.
think it's
Oh,
people like us,
absolutely.
people quote unquote like us, people like us,
PLU.
who do these things, whoever those people are, who maybe nobody out there wants to think of him or herself that way, but I think it's a certain carelessness and a certain laziness sometimes, and I think we poke fun at ourselves. I know I mentioned last week the business about insanity, doing the same thing over and expecting the same results. I've certainly been guilty of using that myself. It's the phrase we're talking about, not me personally having my neck sliced off. Okay, but still, another one which is a kind of minor one, but is too sort of obvious in its irony to be for me not to want to use it is using the expression, the beginning of a famous novel by Charles Dickens about the very topic with which we're speaking, A Tale of Two, and using that to provide a hook to a title of an article or so forth. I've been guilty of that. I will never do it again, and I would like for people to consider not using that. I think it's been used enough.
Yeah, in my case, it's a matter of time pressure. Often, you don't have time to think of the right phrase or something more appropriate, and you use these catchphrases, buzzwords, and so on to give yourself at least the illusion that you're communicating.
But yes, but my main candidate for this evening came up this week, something that had annoyed me for a long time, but I'd forgotten about, and that is an expression that's attributed to Daniel Patrick Moynihan. We are entitled to opinions, to our own opinions, but we are not entitled to our own facts. This is apparently often used as a kind of argument. It's more of an epithet. Again, I think it's lazy, and I think that it reveals as much about who uses it as to about what they may be arguing about. I'm not saying that it can't apply to people who use opinions in lieu of facts, but in the case of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he himself certainly was guilty. Facts are slippery things, and any argument is going to be made on selecting the right facts to make that argument, and depending on the conscientiousness of who's making that argument to really account for the facts. And so why don't we just make the argument and use the facts instead of taking the easy way out of accusing other people of using their own facts?
Yeah, well, that's a good one to batter people with, the supposed facts. Others have been talking about we live in a post-fact society.
Or truthy, that's where truthiness comes in, right?
Exactly. Yeah, things that sound as if they ought to be true, but are not. But anyway, there's a whole theme there that I could return to sometime. But
in the words of the man that Alex Coburn thought was the best post-war U.S. president, Gerald Ford, I could go on and on, but you know the facts.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, my candidate tonight, I'm going to take from the scriptures. That is from Alex Coburn's pamphlet, where he sets up this program. First up, he says, is sustainable. It's been at least a quarter of a century since this earnest word was drained of all energy, having become the prime unit of exchange in the argot of purposeful uplift by non-profit organizations. It was Gro Brundtland in 1987 who laid the curse on common diction of, quote, sustainable development. These days, fundraisers and grant writers swing it round each sentence like an adjectival fanny pack, bulging with self-congratulation. Mostly the term is meaningless or a vague expression of hope. As a final indication of its degraded status, I found it in President Obama's signing statement, which accompanied the whisper of his pen, as on New Year's Eve, a very quiet day when news editors are all asleep, he signed into law the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, for 2012, which handed $662 billion to the Pentagon, and for good measure ratified by legal statute the exposure of U.S. citizens to arbitrary arrest without subsequent benefit of counsel, and to possible torture and imprisonment, sign and die, without an ending date. abolishing habeas corpus. All of this, of course, contrary to the Bill of Rights, but that's what Obama did last New Year's Eve. Don't bother to ask what happens to non-U.S. citizens, says Alex. As he set his name to this repugnant legislation, the president issued a signing statement in which I came upon the following passage, quote, "Over the last several years, my administration has developed an effective, sustainable framework for the detention, interrogation, and trial of suspected terrorists," close quote. So much for sustainable, into the tumbrils with it. Okay. You've been watching News from Neptune for November 9th in the 45th week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been Obama's Double Tap edition. If our program interested you, you might want to look at similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org/livestream. On Saturday, the David Pakman Show at 7 and News from Neptune, this program, repeated at 2 in the afternoon. On Sunday, Labor's Worldview at 4 p.m. Weekdays, Monday to Friday at 7 a.m. Democracy Now!, at 8 a.m. The Big Picture, and at noon, the David Pakman Show. On Monday, the Tom Hartman program, a live 3-hour nationwide call-in, and on Tuesday at 10 p.m., Aware on the Air. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Ron Szoke and David Green. This and other editions of this program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com, and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.